Hello and welcome everybody, I'm Uprising and I'll make it short. Basically, I think Victoria 3's Dev Diary number 41, Revolutions, which is the one that we will deal with today, will be incredibly uncontroversial because basically they are confirming various things that we already suspected and that are simply really good. I mean, these are the confirmations that I have been hoping, that I have been looking for. You can be relieved that Revolutions work in a way I think that is natural, that lets you directly interact with them, and that gives you a genuine choice of storytelling. Which side are you on? What are you doing? And where do you want to go? All of these things are answered in this Dev Diary, so let's just jump in and take a look. Today we'll finally get into details of what fate befalls a state that fails to deliver what its people demand: revolution. Revolutions in Victoria 3 can be seen as a result of failure in the game's economic and political core loops. This is important because it directly and immediately basically connects the two dots between the main gameplay loops, which is of course the economy and politics, and then the actual revolutionary system, which isn't always a given in Paradox games. Oftentimes it, can just happen. In Imperator Rome, for example, we are looking at revolutions triggered largely either by the population or by characters, making it so that sometimes literally everybody but one very powerful character is very happy inside of your world. It is very positive to see that Victoria 3 sticks to its roots, which means sticks to the population rather than to the characters. As much as I like them, of course, they shouldn't be the driving factor here, and they aren't. When this happens, it means that you have failed to balance the material and ideological desires of the different segments of your population, resulting in one or several groups deciding to take matters into their own hands. Play your cards right, and there is a chance that you might bounce back from the crisis even stronger than before. This is important because, yet again, it is basically confirmed that we're looking at a situation where you aren't meant to always, not have a revolution occur. Sometimes it might be beneficial. Again, the counterexample here is is Imperator Rome, of course, where if you lose a revolution, then you lose and it's done. You can never join the revolution. That's just not how it works. And at the same time, Victoria 2, of course, where man, stacks rising up individually is such old tech. It's honestly crazy to think about. I think that most people, unless you play EU4, aren't even aware of this anymore. Either way, the design goal we have kept front and center is that outright armed uprisings should be rare, but should still feel threatening. There's a lot of foreshadowing and opportunity to course correct or compensate if you want to avoid a revolution. Not all movements will actually be powerful or angry enough to pose a real threat to you, and if they aren't, they won't drag you into a pointless war with an obvious outcome, but bide their time until they become relevant. This paragraph right here, to me, basically just sounds like they understand the shortcomings of the earlier systems. Again, big fan of this. A revolution always starts with a political movement demanding some kind of change to the country's laws. The demand might be to enact something novel, so for example, perhaps universal suffrage or workplace safety, to preserve something you're about to change, for example, going from a monarchy to not a monarchy, and then restoring something that you used to have, like free markets, outlawed dissent, and so on. Any of these could end in a violent uprising if the movement is radical enough and you fail to meet its demands. So effectively, we are looking at a situation that we were introduced to ages ago. The idea of you passing a law, and while you're passing it, there's a preservation movement, then afterwards there might be a restoration movement, and before you pass it, there might be an enactment movement. There you go, that's the word. And all of these movements can be radical enough to actually do something. This is important because what it basically does is it ties your revolution to a direct political goal. Obviously, there is some more nuance to this based on the interest groups that support the actual movement, but the fundamental idea here is that you can placate them, you can interact with them, even beyond simply, changing, for example, their standard of living by giving in. If you give in, then the revolution won't happen, and that is something that you can influence. You can weaken the movements as they are by weakening the interest groups that are behind them. All of that stuff is neat because it means that you won't have senseless rebel hunting anymore. There is no such thing at this point. It is all about the topic of, hey, what can we do to interact with this mass movement? Good choice of dealing with this sort of mechanic. Political movements have two major attributes to keep an eye on: their support and their radicalism. A movement's support affects how much help they would lend to enacting their desired change if you choose to go along with them, or how much resistance they might put up in a case of a movement to preserve a law you're trying to change. It also determines how powerful a revolution they can muster should it come down to that. Obviously, it measures how many people want something, and then later on, should people rebel, how many people will be supporting that rebellion. Meanwhile, radicalism measures how likely they are to revolt if they don't get their way. A movement with a strong support and high radicalism is of course very dangerous. A movement with strong support but low radicalism can be a nuisance but is relatively harmless. They will work with the system, maybe raise a placard or two, but won't take up arms. Finally, a movement with low support but high radicalism might not stand much of a chance to overthrow the government on their own, but the instability caused by their ideological fervor could be damaging to your country in the short term and might even create geopolitical opportunities to for your neighbors. This is very interesting. We're going to see how neighbors can get involved down further below as well. Not too surprising, I can already spoil it for you. You will have a diplomatic play happening for a revolution. I love it. It's really good because it means that you can have very flexible support from the outside, very flexible side taking. This is one of those things where I can just say again, much what we hoped, and it's literally that, so very, very positive about it. The movement to restore the Republic is not the most powerful one, but those who do support it care a great deal, and may even be willing to lay down their lives for it. It is supported by both the armed forces and the intelligentsia, not the most likely of bedfellows typically, but united in this case for this particular cause. So this is the movement to restore the presidential republic. You can see only 21 supported, or rather the strength of the support is only 21. What that actually means, I have no idea, honestly. These sort of balancing questions, who knows? But 204,000 pops supported, and they are also supported by, again, the armed forces and by the intelligentsia. This is a highly radical movement that might still go against you. I hope that high radicalism might also mean, for example, you know, an assassination attempt on your king, on your queen, on your president, and so on, that sort of stuff, because that would also mean, of course, that even without a civil war, you would still have an impact on it. These sort of events might even make, you know, for example, a movement that is fairly small into a threat because it could destabilize your country. They already set this up top. I just wanted to bring it up, hoping that that is what they mean by that. A movement's radicalism originates from two sources: the number of radicals among the pops that support the movement and the clout of a supporting interest group with approval low enough to be angry. So basically, if you are a pop that is radical, you will give your radicalism to this movement, but if you are an interest group that supports it, you will only add to the radicalism if you are angry. Meaning, if I have, for example, the intelligentsia and they support the presidential republic restoration, and then I go and pass a different law that the intelligentsia approve of, I might be able to keep them from radicalizing the movement, which is super useful because it makes it so that the movement might be powerful, but they are blocked from actually having a revolution. It's this sort of stuff where I can either go for the standard of living of the pops, I can marginalize, or I can make certain interest groups happy, and all of a sudden I have various responses to the topic of what do I do about this movement, what do I do about the radicalism. This is very important because, again, it makes it so that you have a direct ally to interacting with it and to nurture it or to oppose it, because of course you could be on the side of the intelligentsia here. We will actually see later what that means and what that results into. Since an interest group's approval originates both from the laws of your country and also how loyal versus radical its supporters are, radical pops can potentially double their impact on a movement's radicalism. The major difference between these two factors is that when pops act through their interest group, their impact is through clout, the national share of the political strength, while direct pop support makes a difference through sheer numbers. Meaning the pops just simply count, and then the clout, again, you can address it differently. You can either address the pops, you can address the interest group, you can address both. This is good stuff because this sort of flexibility to deal with rising or with uprisings is something that is missing in most video games that come from Paradox. Once the radicalism of a movement has exceeded a certain threshold, whatever that may be, it will begin organizing an armed uprising. You can monitor this progression in your outliner to see both how rapidly you're moving along the road to revolution and how far you have already gone, both determined by radicalism. What exactly that looks like? Curious? No idea. This means that you can have a direct impact on revolutionary progression. Of course, you can cave to the movement's demands, which will placate them and eventually cause them to disband. But you can also address the problem by identifying the troublemakers and deal with them directly. Either de-radicalize them by improving their living conditions or suppress their contrarian ways by other means. Right here we have a decree. This is violence suppression. Issue violence suppression in North Rhine, plus 2% turmoil mortality. So turmoil based, the higher the turmoil, the more they will die because you are actively suppressing them. Minus 50% radicals from discrimination, minus 50% radicals from standard of living decreases, and minus 50% state penalties from turmoil. The violence suppression right here is what the Prussians did to the weavers of Silesia. That is the exact story. You can follow the same logic, follow the same structure as the Prussians applied it in Silesia with this very decree. I like it. It also requires authority, meaning that if you are a democratic nation, if you are more decentralized, then you probably actually have to talk to this movement. You have to give in to them. If people are unhappy, then you might have to do something that they enjoy. In a dictatorship, in a kingdom, you know, you can do whatever the hell you want. And this is one of these examples. Again, I really like that this has a direct connection to the logic that, of course, was also something that was actively being pursued in this time period. It's always this sort of moving the abstract notion of pop unrest and radicalism into a real-term product that is a bit difficult, I think, for these games, but this is one of these good examples where it just works. Another way of keeping revolutions in check is by establishing a home affairs institution. By sinking bureaucracy into home affairs, you can more easily keep your troublesome elements in check, giving you more room to maneuver politically. Makes sense, of course. I can do many more projects if I have more political will, and having more political will sometimes just means suppressing the opposition. A National Guard can require you to take more overt, proactive steps to keep law and order, while a secret police is able to operate more effectively in the background. This is the Home Affairs institution with the effects of the secret police law. Let's take a look at that. Minus 10% suppression impact on interest group attraction, meaning, I guess that, you know, our suppression impact isn't as much when it comes to suppressing the actual interest group attraction on a public display. People can still join, that's still fine, but minus 5% revolution secession progression speed, we are sabotaging them. Minus 15% suppressed interest group radicalization chance, because we might be able to filter out the radicals early, right? This is the secret police. We simply bag them and then bring them away, and they will never be a part of this movement, meaning the movement itself has a harder time radicalizing. And then minus 10% revolution progression thresholds. This might mean, you know, indeed that you're looking at a situation where these thresholds are actually going down, because once they are radicalizing harder. I'm not sure about this last point. It could mean that it's easier or harder for them, but minus 10%, it's green, so technically good, but revolution progression thresholds. It moves the thresholds for the progression of the revolution down, meaning it makes them easier accessible for the revolution, meaning it makes it easier, right? I'm not certain either way. The idea here is fundamentally that you are suppressing them behind the scenes, and of course, that is a very different approach. You can see a different interest group distribution compared to, for example, the National Guard, but you will already see a smaller radicalization, because again, behind the scenes, you are taking care of the actual people. And look at that. I like this image, reminiscent, of course. I believe they are bobbies here, so I'm pretty sure this is in Great Britain, but I will tell you, this is of course also a very, very intense story that was had in the Biedermeier period of the German history, meaning that you said anything against, you know, any of your local lords, then there was a pretty good chance that you would get nabbed and would go to a Zuchthaus, to a prison indeed. When radical movements are met with obstacles to their revolution for a long time, there is an increasing chance that its revolutionary fervor burns out and the movement disbands. Sometimes you just need to starve them out of attention. Again, I love that you can crush them, you can starve them, you can go behind their back and behind the scenes and sabotage them, you can make people happy, you can take interest groups away by marginalizing or by making them happy. I like the multitude of approaches that you can take here. It's really, really good, and for the first time in Victoria 2, you could always semi-do this as well, but here you now have a direct interaction hotline, basically. This is the lines that these are the lines that you can take, and they are very visible to you, which is important, because information is, of course, basically gold in these games, and Victoria 2 struggled a lot with information transmission. But let's say that you do not manage to placate or obstruct the political movement. In this case, an armed uprising will take a number of your states, proportional to the strength of the movement, and localized roughly where its supporters are, to form a new revolutionary country. This country has the same technology as you, but with some differences in law to reflect the ideological desires of the political movement's leadership. This is so fascinating. Obviously, if you have, for example, let's say the trade unions, they want to enact a presidential republic. They rebel. This new state that they are forming, since the trade unions were the ones running the show, would be significantly different from a trade union enactment movement that rebelled and was actually led by, for example, the intelligentsia. The laws that are behind all of this would then be determined by the IG, I assume determined by whatever laws these IGs favor. If there are multiple IGs that are supporting a movement, then I would assume that this means that they have to find a compromise. You're going to see how they interact with another roughly further below, but I absolutely adore this. This means that you might have a revolution, you might join the revolutionary side, and depending on which IG was in this faction, right, you're all of a sudden looking at a communist country, or you might be looking at an anarcho-capitalist country, right? The idea here, the fundamental idea is that yet again, The actual enact law movement and such that then radicalizes and has the rebellion is just a framework that allows you to be much more specific once you actually take a look at who is running it, right? So I really like this. This is a really good depiction, really good implementation. Yet again, not a surprise. This is one of those things that we always thought would be the case, because we already knew that this would basically work similar to Hearts of Iron 4, and in Hearts of Iron 4, that's the core idea, except Hoi 4 obviously doesn't have as a deep political simulation, if at all, right? But the fundamental idea here is super, super cool. I absolutely love this. That just is a really nice approach. Let's take a look at this. Right, this country has the same technology as you, but with some differences in laws to reflect the ideological desires of the political movement's leadership. Furthermore, the interest groups in this new country will become marginalized if they do not support the revolution, while the opposite is true in the loyalist part of the country. Yeah, I like this. I will say I can see one difficulty here. Let's say, for example, I'm a fairly small country, I just have 4 states, and one of these states is super diverse. There are folks there that are intelligentsia, there are folks that are trade unions, and now they are pitted against one another. Who gets the state? And more importantly, whoever gets the state also gets all the pops that used to be a huge supporter of this revolution, right? I can see this getting a bit muddy in smaller countries. I think the larger a country, if you have Russia, for example, you will always have a pretty good distribution of power and of land and of population that actually supported these endeavors, you know, either the revolution or maintaining the old order. But in smaller countries, I can see this being an issue. But ultimately, I guess if you are in a smaller country, the war itself wouldn't last too long, meaning the pop support doesn't actually matter all that much, because you either win or you lose in a matter of maybe a few years, maybe a few months, right? Anyway, that is my concern there. I don't know how valid it is, because I don't know how that actually plays out, but out of what we have here, that is basically something that worried me at least a little bit. Obviously, characters supporting revolutionary interest groups will join the revolution. This includes not only interest group leaders, but also those generals and admirals that you may have carefully nurtured. This is important. Characters still play a role. Obviously, which character is leading an interest group might also influence, you know, whether this interest group joins the rebellion, joins the movement in the first place, but they are primarily driven by the support and the ideas and the wealth that the actual nation has, that the actual population has. Big fan. I think this is a good compromise. It doesn't overreach as far as characters are concerned, but it still involves them. And of course, it makes sense in this context, and we talked about this ages ago, that generals get an automatic number of troops. If they didn't, you could take away their army, and all of a sudden you were looking at a situation where they have nothing in the revolution. Then again, now I'm thinking this through. If you just don't get the barracks, I don't know, thinking about it, I'm like, that system still doesn't make sense to me. They say it afterwards as well, and it's just logical, right? If they do rebel, and they do not get any of the barracks, then these generals still lose their troops. I don't know exactly whether I'm a fan of the automatic distribution of troops from the barracks to the generals. I thought it was tied to this system, but thinking about it now, since it's actually just tied to the barracks, if you have a general that has people from a specific barrack and they don't get that barrack, then all of a sudden that general loses the entire army and has to do an entirely different one, which doesn't change anything as far as we understand it, but at the same time it kind of makes it obsolete to have this sort of automatic level of troop distribution. Odd. Honestly, I don't know. I would like to see that justified. Anyway, even if you win against them, they won't be making it back to your country alive at least. So these are the characters, and this is also important. Yet again, something that doesn't surprise anyone, I think, but something that we have been worried about for a bit. If you have, for example, if you have Queen Victoria rebel, and she loses, for whichever reason she would be rebelling, but if her side were to lose, she would be gone for good. She isn't coming back. She can't be reinvited. The game doesn't care about that. The devs have talked about the game basically not caring about where the characters are sourced from. They're simply generated, and I get that. Again, characters aren't that important, but especially when you look at France and all of its monarchist movements, that'll be a bit boring. I want to reinvite maybe the Bourbons, maybe the Bonapartes, right? Maybe I want to say, I don't know, who else do we have here? Capet. Aren't those the Bourbons? I believe Bourbon is a house, right, of the dynasty Capet. Either way, I hope you get where I'm coming from there. That is something that, of course, is disappointing, but not surprising at all. This was always clear. All other properties of this new country are dependent on the states they won over. If the revolution takes all your barracks and arms industries, you might be in big trouble. Again, the barracks are automatically tied to a general, but even if that general leaves, and yeah, no, I'm not too convinced by generals getting automatic troops assigned to them. Because you're looking at a situation where in the revolution it all of a sudden doesn't matter anymore. If the barrack building isn't where their general now is on which side, then they just lose their troops either way. Kind of odd. Either way. If the revolutionary states consist mostly of paper mills and art academies, maybe you're not so worried. And of course, the loyalist part of the country retains all their hard-won diplomatic pacts and treaties, while the pretender has to start from scratch. Makes sense, one is the official country, the other one is a revolutionary government. Which one turns out to be official afterwards depends on the war itself. Now here we come to the diplomatic play. What follows is a revolutionary diplomatic play, where the stakes are very simple. The loyalist part of the country tries to crush the rebellion, while the revolutionary country tries to swarm the loyalists. Other countries with an interest in the region can participate in this play as usual. This is cool. This means you can get involved if they're friends, if they're enemies, if somebody's an ideological friend or an ideological enemy, you can get involved if you have an interest in the region. I do wonder what happens, because if you think about Hoi 4, if somebody has a civil war and you are at war with one of these two sides, and then the civil war ends, you get nothing. At least that was this way the last time I played, and that was always very, very annoying, because it makes it so that you're looking at a situation where you can march all the way to Moscow, but in the end, the anti-communist counter-revolution gets all of the land. At least that is the last time I played. I hope that isn't the case here, that every revolutionary war ends, that my separate war still continues or gets finished and so on. That is at the very least how I hope to see this. Who knows what it actually looks like though. As such, revolution might not only result in you having to fight and kill your own people, but your nation might even become the ideological battleground of great powers. Here we have a Switzerland revolution. You see normal Switzerland and you see radical Switzerland. They have 10 troops, they have 14, and then we have Austria on the revolutionary side, and we have, of course, Prussia on the other side with way fewer troops, or maybe it just denotes the quality as well, but either way, this is a huge war just over Switzerland. If the prospect of winning against the revolutionaries doesn't look good, like in all diplomatic plays, you have the option of giving up, but rather than simply backing down and letting the revolutionaries have their way, which, to be frank, you could and should have done a long time ago if that was your intention, in revolutionary plays, you only have an option to switch sides and take over the revolutionary part of the country in its fights against the loyalists. This is good, because what it does is, it gives you the option to choose where you want to be, but it doesn't give you the option to cheese it. Oh, there's a revolution. Oh, I surrender. Although, no, this is a good choice. Yeah, if we walk this through, how they designed this is a good choice. Before the war breaks out, you can go and choose which side you want to be on, but since this play has started, it must be executed. You can't back down and simply game the system, basically. This is a good precaution. It's important to note that there is no potential for a wide peace in a revolution. Either side can capitulate, of course, but a peace cannot be signed without one party pressing their war goal and annexing the other side. By the end of the revolution, only one country will be left standing. This is sensible for Victoria 3 and its time period. I do wish that maybe some sort of division could still be possible. It's not exactly right to call the Korean War, for example, and I'm thinking about a Cold War mod here, right? It's not exactly right to call the Korean War Revolutionary War by any means, right? It's a very separate story there, but the core idea would, of course, be valuable for potentially, you know, having a mod that is a Cold War mod. I get why this is the way it is, not surprising at all either. It's just the fact that in the Victorian period, this is the way it was. There was just total victory or total defeat in the circumstances of a national uprising. Needless to say, while all wars are expensive, civil wars are doubly so. A quick and decisive victory with minimal casualties is the best you can hope for. A long, drawn-out war amassing casualties and devastation on both sides might result in a country so broken that it will take decades to rebuild. But once the war's over, the interest groups that lost the power struggle are defeated for a time. Perhaps during this golden age, you will have the opportunity to effect some much-needed political change and rise from the ashes. This is what I love about this concept. They really initiated this, and it worried me initially when I started reading this, but they initiated this entire dev diary by saying, this is you failing the gameplay loops, failing the loop of the economy and politics. But there really is this idea here. Let's say you are Russia, let's say there is a revolution, let's say you crush them. It could help you, it could prepare you in a way where all of a sudden afterwards you can be much more autocratic. The Tsar can really push through whatever he wants. Because the intelligentsia, because the landowners, who knows who, they are all gone for some time. I assume that defeated means they are marginalized and can't recover, Maybe it is a hard modifier where it's just impossible for a number of views, and maybe it's just a modifier towards people and how likely they are to join an interest group, and just basically reducing that to rubble, that chance, right? Either way, this is a really nice approach because it makes it so that, yes, your country can be completely destroyed, but if you plan it out nicely, you can stage a war, if you will. You know, it can be seen as a genuine civil war, or it can be you provoking them into a small rebellion, crushing them, and then having no opposition anymore whatsoever, all of a sudden being able to pass your cyberspace monarchist autocracy, right? These are the sort of things that I would say are very, very much describing an effective way in this system. It also means that if you are revolutionary, if you are communist, there is no chance of the landholders rising up against you afterwards, and you can do whatever you want because you just defeated them. This is really nice, and it should emulate the radical nature of a post-Civil War country. I will tell you, not too much surprising in this dev diary. It's a really good dev diary. It's a really, really good dev diary. We have a notion here of needing to play fairly well. If you have a revolution that overwhelms you, you might have to switch sides, and then the old project that you enjoyed is all of a sudden gone, or you go down with the ship. And they do approach something else here as well. Losing a revolutionary war means your country loses all its territory and pops, in other words, game over. So pick a side, but do it carefully. Should you end up losing after all, just like in any game over situation, you can choose to continue playing as a different country, including the political faction that just took over yours. But to be clear, we still haven't fully made our mind up on this, and might well change our mind again on the topic of, will it be game over, will you just switch over to the other side? I personally do not think they should change anything. I think this sounds perfect. Let's play this through. If you do not want a revolution, whether because it's gonna be too weak or it's gonna be too strong, act against it beforehand. Once the play starts, you need to struggle for survival. You need to promise other nations certain things so that they help you, other players in multiplayer, right? If you fail to do this, you still, during the diplomatic play, can switch to the other side. The thing is, in single player, especially in Iron Man, you can obviously still ruin the revolution. You can't ever stop this unless you delete the save afterwards. But this gives you all the chances that you can possibly have to save either side of the revolution that you care for. If they did it in a way where after you lose a revolution, even in Iron Man, even in multiplayer, you will always take over the country that remains, people would just basically ruin the revolution no matter what. They would just dissolve all their troops, not invite anybody to the diplomatic play, and so on and so forth. And that obviously isn't acceptable, right? I think it is fine to say you can switch during the diplomatic play, you can engage yourself, you can do this and do that, but if you fail, the Iron Man game is over. If you fail, you have to rejoin as the other nation, meaning the other players in multiplayer will know that you failed, and there can be a rule in multiplayer, for example, you can't nation ruin, you can't ruin your revolution, and so on and so forth. All these are classic house rules, I think, in multiplayer, but even in single player, of course, there is an inherent risk attached to choosing a side, but you have to choose a side. If you're not playing Iron Man mode, obviously you can just jump into the other side, but the motivation behind this mechanic must be that there is a huge risk attached to this, and that if you fail, you failed. But, different from Imperator Rome, you can choose either side. This is the big topic. In Imperator Rome, if a revolution happens and, you know, wins, you will always lose. You can never be the revolution in that game. It's one of the most agitating things outside of, like, trade and migrationary mechanics are so agitating because they're good, but they don't work properly. But again, the revolutionary mechanic is so agitating because it could be good if they let you choose the revolutionary side under certain circumstances. It's always game over there. Victoria 3 says no. You can provoke a small revolution and crush it. You can provoke a large revolution and become it. Or you can provoke a large revolution, crush it with the help of an outside friend, and then pass reforms that otherwise you couldn't have done. This is good stuff. I'm a huge fan of this dev diary. Again, not much is surprising. Most of this was already known, or at the very least suspected, but very happy to see it all now in color in front of us. Next dev diary is part 2 for Civil Wars, Cultural Secessions. Very cool. That is, for example, Hungary, obviously. That is, for example, the Poles. That is, for example, maybe even wars within Spain. That is a topic for the Ottomans, for Qing, you know, for the Great Qing, and so on. For Russia, of course, mandatorily everywhere, basically. Super cool stuff. Very much looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to that. Let me know what you think, especially about the topic that Lacek inquires about here, which is the question of when do you get a game over and under which circumstances. I'm happy with the way it is, but that's just my opinion, and I will see you in the next episode next week for Cultural Secessions. For the moment, later, alligator.